Okay, so we're continuing our lessons on sentences, and this video will focus on complex sentences. So that means we've already covered independent and dependent clauses, we've covered simple sentences. Last video we covered complex sentences, and in that video I asked you to shelve momentarily your understanding of dependent clauses. If you recall, compound sentences deal only with independent clauses. And also recall that independent clauses are also simple sentences. Today, however, I would like for you to regain what you know about dependent clauses because dependent clauses are necessary to form a complex sentence. Also remember that dependent clauses contain a subject and a verb like independent clauses. However, they do not express a complete idea. For example, I gave you this sentence in the very first video, she hated him. She is the subject, hated is the verb, him completes the idea, right? She hated him. I guess you could just have she hated as the complete idea as well. However, in that example, I gave you a direct object. She hated him. And if you recall, I added the word although. And adding that word changes the clause from an independent clause to a dependent clause. So if you put it all together and you listen to it, although she hated him, it does not express a complete idea. You need more words added to it. You need an independent clause for that dependent clause to make sense. Okay, so that's what we're going to put together today. We're going to put together a complex sentence. And a complex sentence contains at least one dependent clause and only one independent clause. It only contains one independent clause because if we were to combine two independent clauses, that would make it a compound sentence. And then if you add a dependent clause to that compound sentence, you get a compound complex sentence, and that's in the next video. So we're not quite there yet. So a complex sentence is at least one dependent clause and one independent clause. Now you could have more than one dependent clause. You could have two or three or four, right? You can keep tacking them on. It's possible. Today we'll mostly just deal with one or two dependent clauses tacked onto one independent clause. Okay, so a dependent clause is made up, of course, of a complex sentence is made up of one dependent clause and one independent clause. And the way that you structure those in the sentence changes the comma placement. So if you begin with the dependent clause and then lead into an independent clause, you separate the two with a comma. So there's the formula right there for you. And I have an example sentence. Even though he hates onions, comma, Jack couldn't stop eating onion rings. Right, so you see the independent clause, Jack couldn't stop eating onion rings. That can stand alone. It makes sense as a verb, a subject, a complete idea. However, if you just take the dependent clause by itself, even though he hates onions, you can hear that the idea is not complete, even though it has a subject of he and a verb of hates. Okay, so you can see there I started with the dependent clause, went into the independent clause, and I've separated the two with a comma. However, you can just as easily reverse those and begin with the independent clause that leads into the dependent clause. And here's the example. Jack couldn't stop eating onion rings even though he hates onions. So it's pretty much the same sentence, just reversed. And if you go from an independent clause from a dependent clause, the comma is unnecessary. A lot of people say that the comma is optional. Some people still include them. And I believe that is still correct. However, most people don't. Most people don't include them. Okay, so this video is going to be quite short. I would like to encourage you to take a look at the handouts I've attached to the resources for this course. In those handouts, you'll see helpful guides to form complex sentences, and complex sentences are formed with subordinating conjunctions, words like although, while, since, relative pronouns like that or which, adverbial clauses like where, or noun clauses. So you have many different ways to form a complex sentence. I'm not going to go through all of those different conjunctions and noun clauses and so on and so forth with you. That would be a monumental waste of time. Just look under the resources in our course. All right, so here's your third video assignment. I'd like you to revise that paragraph from either assignment 1 or assignment 2 to include at least 2 complex sentences. And I want you to underline those complex sentences. So if you look at the first paragraph, that's the original paragraph from assignment 1 that I gave you. That's my example. If you recall, it's about my dog. I'm going to the park. Just gripping stuff. It's a real page turner. In the second paragraph, I have varied my sentences. I have examined the original paragraph and noticed some relationships between the sentences, and I want to make these sentences flow. I want to vary them so that they're more interesting and gripping to read, and I want to add these complex sentences so that my reader can more readily understand the relationship between the first and second sentence and the third and fourth sentence, and then hopefully understand the idea of the paragraph as a whole much better. Okay, so I have highlighted in red the words that are creating these dependent clauses and in turn creating complex sentences. So if you look at the first 2 sentences I've written in the original paragraph, we have Norman paws the bell on the door. He wants to go out again. Clearly there's a relationship there. He's pawing the bell on the door because he wants to go out again. So all I did was add the word because. And you can see here I have started with the independent clause, moved into the dependent clause, which means I don't need a comma. And I'd like to pause here as well because we often use the word because in conversation as a word that signifies an independent clause. So somebody will ask you, why did you do that? And you would reply, because I want to, as if it were a simple sentence. However, remember in standard academic English that because creates a dependent clause. If I were to just write because he wants to go out again, I wouldn't know what the other part of that is, what caused him to want to go out again. Okay, so that's the first complex sentence that I wrote. Let's look at the next 2. The original paragraph has, this is normal for him. He was never meant to be an apartment dog. So I've just reversed those. There's another cause and effect relationship. Since he was never meant to be an apartment dog, comma, this is normal for him. Okay, so there I've started off with the dependent clause, and I've moved into the independent clause. Okay, and so I've separated those with a comma. All right, let's go to the next sentence. And I'm just going to read from the second paragraph this time. My wife and I take him and his brother Puck to the park often, where he gets plenty of exercise. Okay, so independent clause leading into a dependent clause, and I've started that with where, which is an adverbial clause. And remember, it doesn't matter if you remember all of the jargon, as long as you can understand the concepts. So let's just take the dependent clause where he gets plenty of exercise. Now, this isn't separated by a comma, so it makes it a little more difficult to recognize as a dependent clause. However, utilize what you know about dependent clauses. They have a subject, a verb, but do not express a complete idea. So if I were just to write where he gets plenty of exercise, it really wouldn't make any sense. Okay, so it depends on the independent clause that precedes it to gain its meaning. All right, next. This is a complex sentence with 2 dependent clauses. All right. First, while he is at the park, there's my first dependent clause. It's leading into an independent clause, which means I separate it with a comma. While he is at the park, he loves to run and retrieve the ball. Now, I could end the sentence there. I could put a period and that would be fine. However, I wanted to tack on the last sentence from this first paragraph with a relative pronoun which. Okay? So which means he always manages to get wet and smelly. All right, so I'll talk to you here for just a second about the differences between which and that. Which means that it's a non-essential part of the sentence. You could leave it out and the sentence would still make sense. The word that is used if the clause that follows after the word that is absolutely imperative to the meaning of the sentence. Okay, so here we have which means he always manages to get wet and smelly. All right, so that's what I would like for you to do for this third video assignment. Just to recap, complex sentences contain one or more dependent clauses and only one independent clause. Okay, and I would like for you to take either the paragraph from assignment 1 or 2 and revise that to have at least 2 complex sentences and underline those. Okay, I hope this was helpful for you. I hope everything makes sense. Remember to consult the resources for the course to find those handouts on subordinating conjunctions, relative pronouns, so on and so forth, and that should help you in this assignment. If something doesn't make sense, of course, you can always get in touch with me or hit the rewind button and watch the video again. All right, see you in the next video.